Hey everyone, Nubkeks here, and in today's video I'm giving you my tier list for the best specs of every role in Castle Nathria. So the best DPS, the best tanks, the best healers. We're going to cover absolutely everything. As you guys know, Castle Nathria has been open now for a couple of weeks. We've got lots of info from normal, lots of info from heroic, and the mythic race is ongoing. Currently limit are actually on the second last boss. We can certainly see though what they've used for all the bosses so far. We can see what they're gearing up, and there are some pretty strong trends. So I'm going to try to sort of parse some of that here today and give you some explanations. I'm also going to try to be fairly nice to the specs as much as I can. I think you guys rightly gave out to me for being a bit down on Feral Druid in the last video here. We're discussing that the specs performing well in Castle Nathria. So I will try to point out the good things about each spec as well. And remember, of course, this tier list is just supposed to be a guide. If you are racing, for World First, I'm sure you know this stuff already. If you're not racing for World First, it's cool to know. It's certainly something that you can play around with your own raid comps and with your own class and spec choices. But I mean, this is not a gospel to live by, guys. This is just a guideline. So don't be, don't be a jerk about it, and don't be kicking good players out of your groups because they might not be the perfect spec that you want. You could be losing out on some really good players that could enhance your time in the game. We're going to have a quick sponsor segment here in just a second, but before you get into that, just how I'm going to rate these specs, all the specs in the game. I'm going to consider every single spec to sort of start off at C tier. If a spec's doing really well, move it up to B. If it's doing exceptionally well, move it up into A. And then what I'm also going to do is I'm going to give you an S tier, which is going to be the best melee DPS, the best range DPS, and then the best healer and the best tank, in my opinion. So just the #1 specs for their respective roles, I want to give a special highlight to, but it's just limited to just one spec for each role. So yeah, there you are. Before we dive into that though, I want to take a minute to talk to you about the sponsor of today's video, Raid Shadow Legends. If you haven't heard me talk about Raid before, it's an incredible RPG. It's available on mobile and on PC. I mostly play on PC on my second monitor when I'm doing my world quests and Torghast and all that good stuff. You can find links in the description to download it for yourself. And Raid have just released an incredible new piece of content here at the start of December. It's called the Doom Tower. There's over 120 floors of different fights. There are secret challenge rooms, which will make you have to think outside the box, such as using a team with only support champions. At every 10 floors, there's a boss encounter, and these bosses are incredibly nasty, but if you're able to take them down, you can start earning some unique gear sets that are only available in the tower. And getting in the Christmas spirit as part of this promo here on the channel, if you sign up through the link down below, you will get a free champion, Bulwark. He's a Void champion. They're the hardest to get in the game, and he's incredibly good at fighting these bosses. So if you haven't tried Raid before, now is the perfect time to dive in. And there's also going to be a Christmas event now in the second half of December with 14 new champions. So if you want to dive in and give Raid a go, make sure to follow the link in the description. You're going to get Bulwark as a free champion. You get an XP booster, 50 gems, some energy refills, and even an ancient shard. It's all there for free for everyone who follows the link. You can get the rewards then in-game in your inbox up in the top right-hand corner while you're on the Bastion page. Alright guys, well, we're back. Let's do this. Let's dive in. We're going to do the DPS first. We're going to combine as well melee and range DPS. So let's dive in here. We're going in like alphabetical order of the specs, and also shout out to the guy who made this tier list on Tier List Maker, this template. I respect the fact that Guardian Druid is alphabetically listed as if it was Bear Druid. I think that's phenomenal. First up, we have Affliction Warlock, and this is definitely jumping up straight into A tier, our first A tier spec. The Affliction Warlock just has a phenomenal amount of damage. They've got good AoE damage now. They've got absolutely brilliant single target damage. If you look at the top guilds in Race to World First, Sludge Fist has been the first massive wall boss. Just extremely difficult for them to beat with the gear that they have. Affliction Warlock really coming through just from the pure damage they put out. They're also a very, very tanky spec, and they provide, of course, Warlock utility. Health stones, gateways, all of that good stuff. Warlock Affliction is absolutely excellent. They are phenomenal. Next up, we have the Arcane Mage. The Arcane Mage, I think, is a little bit of a sleeper spec. It's still really, really unpopular. However, I think Arcane Mage is actually pretty okay. I'm going to put it actually in the B tier. I certainly think for these early weeks of progress, where we are progressing on the first few bosses of Mythic or Heroic or even Normal, depending what you're doing. For example, Arcane Mage, they can pump a ton of damage into the ads on Huntsman Altimore, and then their Touch of the Magi will explode, and because of the damage amp, it will do loads of damage to the bosses. And similarly, I think that Arcane Mage does provide some interesting damage cooldowns. With its arcane power, with its Touch of the Magi, with Rune of Power, it can do some really, really big burst damage onto priority targets at sort of different timings than Fire or Frost can. On top of course, bringing really good mage utility. They bring Arcane Intellect. It's a mandatory raid buff. 5% more damage and healing from your spellcasters, of course, including your healers. Just insanely valuable. Very survivable with their blinks. They can spec into Shimmer, Alter Time, Ice Block, Mirror Image. They've got so many tools. Mage is really good. And yeah, Arcane Mage, like I said, it's unpopular, but I think it's a bit of a sleeper. They do have the potential to actually do extremely good damage on some of these bosses that shouldn't be overlooked. Another spec, which is definitely, I think, a bit of a sleeper, is the Arms Warrior. I'm actually putting Arms up in the A tier. I know. Arms has been, in the first couple of weeks of the raid, they were doing pretty bad damage, let's be real. But when we're looking at some of these, the fights now as we go further, and with some of the Arms buffs, okay, their single target damage isn't that incredible, but what are they good at? They're excellent at execute damage. And execute damage is the most valuable damage type in the raid. There's lots of bosses that get very nasty when they're low on life. They also have excellent cleave damage, and they've got really, really good burst AoE damage. If you look at some of those world first mythic kills, you're going to see the Arms Warriors actually really popping off on fights like Lady Enerva Darkfane, where there's lots of ads spawning in, or Sun King Salvation, Huntsman Altimore. They can really do some good work on those fights. On top of that, the utility that an Arms Warrior brings is very strong. Battle Shout, phenomenal, 5% more attack power. Helps your tanks, helps all of your physical damage dealers. And Rallying Cry, right? Protecting your team, that's really good too. It's a good raid defensive CD. Arms Warriors are actually pretty solid. You're not going to be bringing like 5 of them by any means. You probably only bring 1, but that one Arms Warrior can make a very good contribution to your team. Next up, we have Assassination Rogue, and this is the first spec I'm definitely going to be a bit down on here. As a rogue, of course, we have all of that rogue utility, right? Good utility. They got Sprint, they can pop Cloak of Shadows, they can soak orbs on things like Hungering Destroyer, they can soak the traps on Artificer Zymox, they can do some pretty cool stuff. Unfortunately for Assassination, they got a big buff recently. Maybe if they get another buff, I will say this, if they get another buff, we could see Assassination become pretty cool. But unfortunately right now, they don't have the single target damage. They don't have the AoE damage that the other rogue specs bring. They're noticeably behind. So I think that does unfortunately make them one of the weakest specs in Castle Nathria. They've got great utility, that rogue utility, but there's 2 other rogue specs and their damage is just quite lacking. Skipping on ahead, we've got Beast Mastery Hunter. I'm going to leave Beast Mastery Hunter in the C tier. We'll rearrange these tiers in a second. We're just going to put the specs in first. I would consider, for example, BM to be stronger than Assassination by a good chunk. And again, BM Hunter, they bring really nice utility. They can do lots of things on the move. Turtle is very, very useful, that immunity, and you can move while using that immunity. You can do some fun things with, again, soaking orbs, much like the Assassination Rogue can on some of these fights. It's pretty good. Their damage is decent. It's okay, and that really is the thing that makes them not really stand out to me. Their damage isn't popping off. And you've got other hunter specs that are in there that are bringing the same utility but are popping off more. So that's why I'm leaving them in the C tier. They're just not jumping out to me as a spec that's climbing the list. Balance Druid then. Well, Balance Druid, I'm sure you guys know, this is another A tier spec. Balance Druid has obviously fantastic Druid utility. Really cool. You've got Innervates for your healers to help out with them. You've got knockbacks with Typhoon that can be really useful to control, for example, the Phoenixes on Sun King Salvation in the intermission. You can knock those Phoenixes away. But the big thing they have is they have incredibly good single target damage, and they also bring incredibly good uncapped AoE damage in Starfall, which hits everything in a massive area around you. So again, on those fights with lots of ads, Sun King Salvation, the Council of Blood, if you're not killing Niklaus first, Balance Druid is absolutely going to dominate those damage meters with that Starfall. He's pumping out tons of AoE damage and being very mobile while doing it as well. And they're no slouch on those single target fights. Again, these world top guilds are going to be bringing, 2, maybe even 3 Balance Druids some fights. Balance Druid is really, really solid. We have 2 Warlock specs coming up next, the other 2 Warlock specs, getting them done all together. We've got Demonology and Destruction. Again, for me, kind of like Beast Mastery Hunter, I'm actually going to put these guys in the C tier. They're not too bad, but they're not really jumping out. Like, that Warlock utility is still there. But again, if you already have an Affliction Warlock, you don't need the Healthstones. You don't really need another Gateway. Especially, I think even Gateway's a little bit undervalued maybe, or devalued in this tier, I should say, because we have a lot of other movement cooldowns, right? Shamans are popping off at Windrush. Druids, Balanced Druids now, I forgot to mention. Stampeding Roar, incredible utility. So good. Giving just a big burst of movement speed to everyone in your group. Great for dodging things on Shriekwing, running away from Hungering Destroyer, getting to your position on Council of Blood, moving away from the Hand of Destruction on Sire to Nathria as the final boss. There's just so many uses for that. It's insanely good. So with all those movement CDs sort of in the raid and floating around, the Gateway is a little bit less valuable. These are still 2 survivable specs. You know, they're Warlocks. They're still tanky enough. Destruction, I think, could do very well on cleave damage. But their single target damage isn't amazing. They've got good burst AoE, but it's very tied into Infernal. They're not maybe as reliable, as consistent as maybe Affliction can be. Demonology, again, has pretty good burst damage at their Tyrant, and they could do some work on single target fights. They're definitely specs that have strengths, but they're not jumping out as being some of the better ones. Next up, this is the tough one to rank, actually. We've got the Elemental Shaman and Enhancement Shaman too. I'm going to put Elemental Shaman in the B tier, and I'm going to put Enhancement Shaman in the C tier. The reason being, I think Elemental is doing pretty good damage, pretty solid damage. It's a good spec. You know, they do have some uncapped AoE with Earthquake, though things need to be stacked in. They've got decent single target. It's not the best damage in the game, but what they do bring is Windrush Totem, and Windrush Totem is incredible. These top guilds are often stacking Resto Shamans, so they have lots of Windrush Totems, but let's be honest, a lot of your pug groups, a lot of your guilds, you're not going to have, you know, 2 or 3 Resto Shamans. That's not something that you're going to have. Elemental Shaman does bring that utility with that Windrush Totem, which is just super valuable. Good priority target damage as well on fights where you can multi-dot with Flame Shock and then turn that into single target damage. It's pretty solid, so I think they are a very solid choice. I think Enhancement Shaman is also similar. They've actually got pretty solid damage. Their damage isn't terrible. I think the reason that and they also bring that same utility, the reason that I move them down a tier here is kind of simple. It's that they are a melee spec, and they are also quite squishy. They're quite vulnerable. They don't have a lot of the defensive that other specs have, and that definitely does hurt them a little bit. But yeah, they still bring good damage. Again, if you guys are doing like normal or heroic raiding, you know, you can absolutely bring these specs and they could completely dominate that raid. They could do super well. It's really, you know, gets more serious, I guess, when you move up to Mythic, and it's kind of going, how do specs actually survive? We need lots of range DPS to cover these mechanics, like soaking, the bottles on Lady Nerva Darkvein, for example. We can only bring so many melee. And a lot of the melee, like Arms Warrior, are bringing those core raid utility things like Battle Shout. We'll come to Demon Hunter in a second, you know. So those melee spots can be a little bit limited. There's a few other specs doing better. It can be tough to fit in that Enhancement Shaman. Here's an interesting one. Next up, hey, look who it is. It's the Feral Druid. I started off, I think, in this video mentioning that I was a bit too harsh on the Feral Druid. I'm actually putting Feral Druid solidly up in the B tier. In fact, I'd probably value them a little bit higher. But yeah, Feral Druids, guys, they are popping off on damage. You know what? I might actually move them up a little bit more. Feral Druids are blasting damage. They really are. They've got really solid damage output, a surprising amount. Nothing to sneeze at. On top of that, they bring the Stampeding Roar. They bring that utility. Again, the thing that makes them a bit weaker for sure, they don't have the innervative Balanced Druids. That definitely sucks. And also they are melee, and you can have limited melee spots. You know, there's so many melee specs in this game, and they bring some really important raid buffs. It can be tough to fit those in, but you guys might know, have you seen any Feral Druids popping off in your raids? Because they can do some really good damage. It's definitely not a spec to you know, ignore, that's for sure. Then we got the next 2 mage specs then, Fire and Frost. For me, I think Fire Mage is definitely an A-tier spec. This one kind of really grew. This kind of came a little bit out of nowhere, you know, towards the end of beta. You know, there were obviously rumblings of it. We saw it in the Keystones Masters tournament when that came out. Fire Mage doing super well. It's definitely climbed to the top as the best mage spec. Fire Mage has really good burst damage with Combustion, and they can actually do some really good and powerful AoE damage as well. Of course, you really do need a mage, one mage at least, in your raid to bring that arcane intellect, and fire mage is the best choice. They do good damage, the best damage out of all the mage specs overall to go along with it. They're good on really all of the fights in the raid, whereas arcane is a little bit, arcane's definitely a little bit more picky in terms of the fights and how to make it work on the fights, where fire just kind of clicks a bit better. Are you going to bring loads of them to the fight? Well, no. Like you could stack up a few affliction warlocks for some fights, or a few balance druids. One or two fire mages is probably enough. You wouldn't be bringing 3 or 4 like you did in Nyalotha. But fire mage, yeah, we thought we might get a change up to the top mage spec this tier, but it turns out, hey, fire, as it's getting some of that gear, is really performing very well. So there you are. Of course, that means that frost mage, I do consider this to be the weakest mage spec. I'll throw it in there. Frost mage, their damage in the raid just isn't that good. Fire and arcane, you can both run Night Fae and do really good in AoE and single target with that. Frost mage is certainly struggling a lot more. They're doing quite well, I think, in Mythic Plus, but in raiding, they're certainly not standing out. They're definitely not standing out as a spec. They do okay damage. Of course, they still bring incredible mage utility with that mobility and just the crazy amount of defensives that mages have. They have all of that. They do. They've got double ice block even, which other mage specs don't bring. And that can be really nice to survive some of the nasty burst damage and overlaps you can have. But yeah, I think they for me are only C tier. They're not doing enough in terms of their damage performance on these particular fights to move higher. Another Frost spec then is the Frost Death Knight. I think, again, this is sort of an underrated spec simply because of the spec that it's directly competing with. That's Unholy DK. He's at the end. We'll come to him. I think the Frost Death Knight is actually underrated. I'm actually going to put them at the B tier, I think, though I would very much put them at the bottom of the B tier, again, because of Unholy DK, which we'll talk about in a bit. But as a Frost Death Knight, you do bring that single target grip. That can be very useful on some of these fights, like Huntsman and Counts of Blood for controlling some of that ad positioning. And you bring Anti-Magic Zone. This is the best raid defensive CD in the game, giving magic damage resistance to everyone that stands inside of it. That is just insanely strong in Castle Nathria. It's better than Rallying Shout. It's better than Darkness. It is like the ultimate raid CD. It's almost as good as a Disc Priest Barrier. That's how good this thing is. It's completely nuts. It can change how the fights work. Also worth noting, I forgot to mention this with Shaman, Sire to Nathrius, the last boss. What's the big mechanic of Phase 1? You're trying to remove these stacks from you so that you can actually reach the center during the intermission, because each stack is slowing you down. Shaman can completely cheese that mechanic by going into Ghost Wolf. Death Knights can also completely ignore that mechanic from their Death's Advance. I can't remember what it's called, but they can't be slowed below a certain amount. So they can just have as many stacks as they want and walk on in. It's totally fine. Having Shaman and Death Knights in your raid can really help out your strategy on Sire Denathrius. It's the hardest boss in the game right now. They can help you beat that. Get through Phase 1 and that intermission, which is actually quite challenging, I would say. So yeah, I think that Frost Death Knight is in the shadow of its bigger and better brother, but I think that they still do bring a lot on top of obviously bringing good burst damage and AoE. Their damage is decent. It's just, again, slightly overshadowed. Okay, Fury Warrior's up next. Again, Fury Warrior unfortunately is in the C tier. Arms Warrior is just, they're the bigger, better brother of the Fury Warrior right now. This is the tier for Arms. Fury, the damage just isn't there. Perhaps there will be a buff. That could always happen, and Fury could start climbing back up. Again, both of these Warrior specs are mostly running Venthyr for Condemn. Yeah, I think Fury, it's still okay. It still brings Rally. It's just the damage is certainly a little bit undertuned at the moment. They can't compete with some of these top specs, especially for that melee spot. Havoc Demon Hunter is actually doing pretty decent on damage, certainly in AoE. Their single target damage is lacking. It's not up there at the top for sure, but in AoE, in Cleave, which a lot of these sort of early and middle fights in the raid definitely have, they do very, very well. I'm going to put them up in the B tier. Again, part of this is due to the sort of bigger and better brother, where a lot of raid groups are bringing Vengeance Demon Hunters for that Chaos brand, 5% more magic damage taken. The Havoc Demon Hunter, not as essential. However, if you don't have a Vengeance Demon Hunter, in that case, Havoc would probably jump up to A tier. You really want that Chaos brand in there. It's kind of a mandatory raid buff to have. Darkness isn't bad. as a raid cooldown, especially if you sync it up with a Spirit Link totem. The randomness of darkness is like a 20% chance to avoid damage. That randomness is very unreliable, but you can't combo it with Spirit Link where everybody shares health in the raid, and that just averages it out as damage reduction, makes it actually very, very strong. Yeah. I think the Havoc doesn't shine as much as they did perhaps in some of the other raid tiers. They still have their mobility, but they're a bit squishier. Again, good AoE damage, but like I said, there's lots of specs, lots of melee specs that do that good AoE damage. So there's a decent option, a solid option, but they're not certainly, I think, an essential option for your raid. Next up, here's an option that probably is essential. It's the Marksmanship Hunter. Definitely up on the A tier. Marksmanship Hunters, they're kind of infamous right now for absolutely destroying. They got a very big nerf from Blizzard for day one of Mythic, but that hasn't stopped them. These top kills are stacking 3, 4, maybe sometimes only 2, but I mean, only 2 out of a 20-person raid. Marksmanship Hunters. Marksmanship is absolutely blasting. They're doing super good damage. They have insane burst AoE damage in single target and in AoE, I should say. Both of them. They just have incredible burst damage. Really, really strong. On top of bringing that Hunter utility, you know, immunity that you can move with Aspect of the Turtle. Just really, really good. Yeah, just incredible damage. This is certainly the tier of the Marksmanship Hunter. They are a premier range spec for sure. Coming down then, this one is interesting. I feel like this is a bit of a sleeper spec as well. It's the Outlaw Rogue. I would actually put Outlaw Rogue somewhere in the B tier. This is the second rogue spec we have, and obviously Assassination is undertuned. Outlaw Rogue is actually doing really good damage. It's doing really good damage in AoE, and it's also doing really good damage in single target. I feel like it is a bit of a sleeper. You know, we're all excited about Sub Rogue coming back, but I think Outlaw arguably might be even better. It's I'm not 100% sure, but Outlaw is certainly doing good damage numbers. Again, they are a melee spec, which is a little bit of a disadvantage, that's for sure. Rogue utility is nifty. It's not, I think, certainly essential. They're not bringing a damage type or anything that I think is essential to your raid, but much like the Elemental Shaman, for example, they are definitely a big asset to any raid team that they join. Coming down here then, okay, we're almost done actually with the DPS. We have the Retribution Paladin. Again, I would put Retribution Paladin in the B tier, maybe a bit lower down. I think, you know, Holy Paladin is actually doing very well, and they're bringing that Paladin utility to the raid. But if you don't have a Holy Paladin or a Protection Paladin, I certainly think that, like the Havoc Demon Hunter, Ret Paladin becomes really good. The issue that I have with Ret Paladin is that what they do is, again, quite similar to what a lot of different specs do. A lot of these melee specs already do, which is great burst damage in both single target and AoE. They can do good burst damage. Their overall damage is a bit lower, but that's okay because, you know, bursting down adds, bursting bosses in important phases can be more valuable than high overall damage. That's why I ranked Arms up in the A tier. Although their overall damage can be a bit weak, it's that type of damage, and when they do the damage, that actually does make them strong, I think, or pretty solid. Ret Paladin, yeah, I think, again, they're pretty solid. I rank them above the C tier because of that utility that they bring. Removing bleeds is nice. The immunity in Divine Shield is pretty nice too. But yeah, they're certainly not, they're not doing as crazy on that damage meter, and that melee, those melee spots are being filled by one class in particular, that or a couple of classes doing very well. Next up is the Shadow Priest. Shadow Priest is going to go up in the A tier. I think Shadow Priest is maybe performing a little bit under expectations, seeing as a lot of the other top sort of specs got kind of nerfed down a bit and Shadow Priest didn't. I think Shadow Priest is still doing well. They're still doing very good damage, and especially single target damage. Funny enough, actually, the biggest strength of Shadow for most of BFA was their split cleave damage and their consistent split cleave damage. With lots of adds spread around the place, they could do very consistent damage. Guess what? In Shadowlands, they're not good at that anymore. No, they're very good at single target damage. They're good when stuff is stacked up. They can spec into Searing Nightmare, but that's really more of a dungeon thing. Their AoE damage, their burst AoE damage is almost non-existent, but their single target is strong. They can also get a Power Infusion Legendary and Power Infuse a Teammate. That's a 2-minute cooldown that gives you like 20% haste, I think. Maybe 25% haste actually for 20 seconds, which is a really big buff. So Shadow Priest is performing. They're well. They're going to be a welcome spec in your raid. Again, kind of like the mages, you probably only bring 1 or 2 maximum. You're not going to stack more like you would with, you know, the Marksmanship Hunter, the Affliction Warlock, or the Balanced Druid. Sorry, should be ahead here. But they are still pretty. They're doing solid. They are very good. They are very, very good. Sub Rogue, I'm putting up right beside the Outlaw Rogue. I'm taking a little bit of a risk here. I think I'm actually going to rate the Sub Rogue maybe a little bit lower than Outlaw. Sub Rogue has excellent single target damage, and they've got good AoE damage. Very bad at cleave, though. You know, the 2 or 3 targets, not really their forte. One nice thing that Sub Rogue does bring that's unique to them is their damage cooldown. Shadowlands has charges, so you can, to a certain degree, that's a little bit limited by Symbols of Death, but to a certain degree, you can, you know, delay your damage cooldown a little bit to really burst damage at an opportune moment. You can save up that charge. You can even save up a couple of charges, potentially, sync it up and have them come back at the right time and do damage when you really need it most, which I think is very valuable. So Sub Rogue, again, you know, these World First skills, they're not bringing these rogues to these higher end fights. They're really mostly just focusing on these A tier specs. But I think for most of us in most raid groups, I think the rogue specs here are going to do actually very, very well. Survival Hunter is going in the C tier. It's going in the C tier. Again, always the problem, it's a melee spec. And Marksmanship Hunter is just so damn good right now that it's hard to justify. You're going to have that Hunter utility. It's hard to justify filling in a melee spot with a Survival Hunter. Even a BM Hunter, it's struggling there as well. So yeah, Survival, they can do some decent damage on a single target. They're okay, but there's nothing there that makes them jump out like some of these other specs. You know, there's nothing on the level of Anti-Magic Zone or Arcane Intellect. They just don't have that. So that's why they stay in the C tier. Then we've got 2 specs left. Unholy Death Knight. It's going right to the top, ladies and gentlemen. Right to the top, the Unholy Death Knight. Not really too much of a surprise here. A lot of these World First skills are stacking 4 Unholy Death Knights in some of these fights. That's a fifth of the raid group is taken up by one single spec, and a melee spec at that. Yeah, Unholy Death Knight, they just have incredible burst damage. They've got great single target. They've got great AoE. Their AoE even has the utility because they're going Necrolord with the Abomination Limb Covenant ability, which is going to pull adds in on top of having Death Grip. And most of they even have Execute damage as well through their talent tree. And of course, they're bringing that Anti-Magic Zone, one of the most powerful raid defensive cooldowns. Unholy Death Knight is a force to be reckoned with. This is definitely the tier of the Unholy Death Knight. They are the best melee spec in the game. You know what the heck? We're just going to throw them up here. These are the 2. You guys know. These are the best melee specs in Holy DK. The best range is Marksmanship Hunter. They just sort of stand above. I would say the worst spec probably right now is Assassination Rogue. Is just a bit too undertuned. That would be the last spec I'd be bringing. Unfortunately for them, we have one final DPS spec though, which is the Windwalker Monk, and an unsung, underrated spec. It's going up in the A tier. Yeah, that's right. Windwalker is actually really good. It's actually really, really good. Believe it or not, Windwalker is popping off in terms of damage. They're doing phenomenal damage on top of, you know, it's good single target, it's good AoE, they've got good burst, it's kind of on demand like the Sub Rogues. They got a couple of charges of Storm, Earth, and Fire. They're just really great. They're doing really well. Also, Mistweaver is not doing amazing right now. It sort of frees you up then. You don't need to bring a Brewmaster. You can bring other tanks, like get that Paladin utility, get the Demon Hunter utility maybe in your tanks, and bring a Windwalker for that Monk debuff, that Mystic Touch, 5% more physical damage taken, because they're blasting. They really, really are. Definitely do not sleep on Windwalker Monk. I know that historically they are like the worst spec ever in rating terms. Like they're usually the most undertuned spec on average in an expansion. Well, in Shadowlands here in Castle Nathria, that is not the case. Windwalker is doing really, really good damage. Right, let's reset this. Let's get into the tanks, guys. Sorry, this video is maybe a little bit long. I kind of want to give a good insight into some of the strengths of all these specs, which is why we're going so in depth. The first tank spec we have here is the Guardian Druid. I'm actually putting the Guardian Druid up in the B tier. I think a lot of the tanks actually are going to end up in the B tier. Yeah, they're solid. These are a very underrated class, a very underrated spec, the Guardian Druid. But the Guardian Druid brings excellent mitigation. They're very, very safe. They're very stable, very sturdy. And of course, they're bringing that stampeding roar to your group. You know, they're not as flashy. They're not the top spec for tanking. But they're a very solid option that's always underrated. And here's the truth. If you have a Guardian Druid tanking for your raid team, they're going to be a great tank, and you're going to be glad you have them. You're going to notice that utility. They will be a solid performer that is very, very underrated. Next up, we have Blood Death Knight. Now, Blood DK, I'm also putting up in the B tier. Blood DK did get, I might even rank them slightly higher than Guardian. It's hard to say. They're obviously a lot less safe, I would say, than Guardian in terms of tanking, their mitigation. Their health bar kind of bounces up and down, right? It's kind of a swingy health bar. They did get some nice buffs on Mythic Day 1 to help them catch up in terms of damage. And certainly, Blood DK, they bring the Mass Grip ability, which is very nice on some of these fights with ads like Sun King and Council of Blood. Single target grips are still good. And of course, they do bring Anti-Magic Zone. I think that's why I'd rate them a little bit lower. Look, you're almost definitely trying to scramble to grab some Unholy Death Knights into your group. You're already going to have some Anti-Magic Zones. It's always good to have more, though. It is always good to have more. So I think Blood DK is still a solid option that brings some cool utility. Yeah, it brings some really good utility. Next up, we have the Brewmaster Monk. And Brewmaster, I would probably put up in the A tier. Again, Brewmaster is doing just very solid damage reduction. They bring that Monk utility, which is a little bit harder to come by. I mean, let's be honest here. Monk is, I believe, the least played class in the entire game. So you could be scrambling to find a Monk player for your raid to bring that debuff, that Mystic Touch. Brewmaster brings it. They've got that circle of the Ring of Peace. And they're just a very stable tank. They're very reliable with their stagger mechanic. Damage comes in at a steady rate over time. You're not going to get taken by surprise. They're a good solid tank. I would say that they're not S tier. They were S tier, I think, for pretty much all of BFA. They were the best tank. You really wanted a Brewmaster. If you weren't bringing Brewmaster, you kind of weren't doing it right in a way. I don't think that's the case anymore, but they're still a solid tank. The next tank we have here is that's a Havoc Demon Hunter. Vengeance is further down the alphabet. Where are we? It's the Protection Paladin. And I would put Protection Paladin up in, maybe the A tier. Yeah, maybe up in the A tier. You know, they're doing really good damage. They're bringing good rage utility. You know, the lay on hands is actually kind of nice. For example, on Sun King Salvation, you can kind of cheese the healing on that fight a little bit with the Protection Paladin and the healing that they can do. They do bring a Divine Shield to deal with some of those nasty bleeds. They bring Bop, which they can use to help their team, Blessing and Protection, to deal with some of those, again, nasty bleeds in this raid. So I think they are a good solid option on top of bringing a Paladin aura if you don't have it. I will say if you do have like a Holy Paladin, I think the value Protection Paladin probably dips back into the B tier. But I do think that they are a good option. The next tank then is Protection Warrior. And now here's the thing, guys. You know that when I did my tank ranking videos, I said that Protection is not as fun as it was in BFA, and I stand by that. I did another video where I talked to my guildies about the specs they were enjoying. And again, our one of our tank mains said, yeah, he mained Protection for a lot of BFA. Not as fun in Shadowlands. Here's the thing, though. They're an A tier spec. They are an A tier spec. Protection Warrior is super slept on right now. Really underrated. Protection Warrior brings very stable damage intake. They're very good at mitigating damage. And on top of that, they bring, of course, a Rallying Cry. They bring Battle Shout. They have that really good rage utility. Yeah, Protection Warrior is just super stable. Again, most people completely dismiss them. Hi, Sins Blink. Thanks for following. I'm not streaming, but I'm using my streaming software to record. But yeah, these world first skills are actually bringing Protection Warriors. So for example, on Sludge Fist, you know, Limit and Echo, they're bringing in those Protection Warriors to tank for them, right? That's what they're bringing in. They even brought like Protection Warriors alongside Arms Warriors to some fights because they are so solid. So yeah, Protection Warrior, arguably we could maybe even rank it even higher. They're very, very underrated. I really think they are. I think a lot of people have dismissed them because they're not as fun, but they are very, very good. And then the final tank spec is the Vengeance Demon Hunter. I think that Vengeance is the S tier tank spec. I think they are the best tank in the game overall right now. They bring just really, really solid damage. They've got great damage mitigation as well. Legendary is really helping with that too. And yeah, they also bring Chaos Brand, which lets you, you know, be a bit more flexible with your melee composition. You're not reliant on Havoc Demon Hunters. And yeah, you know, the Kyrian Elysian Decree is just doing so much work for Vengeance Demon Hunter. They're great for AoE. They've got great control with their sigils. They are one of these standout tanks right now. I even think that Echo, who are in contention for World First, were trying to tank Sludge Fist. Arguably the hardest tank hitting boss in the entire game right now. They're trying to solo tank that with a Vengeance Demon Hunter, a fight that's supposed to punish 2 tanks, while Vengeance could handle it alone. So I think that does make them, for me, the S tier tank, the best tank right now. Finally then, going into the healers, let's take a look at the healers here. Discipline Priest is up first. Discipline Priest, I think I will put up in the A tier, but Disc Priest it's not the crazy dominant, the best. You know, for a lot of BFA, certainly for Eternal Palace, Azhar's Eternal Palace, for Nyalotha, even a good chunk of Nyalotha, though Holy Paladin kind of came in there. But Disc Priest was certainly in contention for being the best spec in the game in terms of healers. I think they're still very strong, they're very solid, but they're not as crazy. What does Disc bring that's so good? Number one, they bring really good damage, and that's really useful. Number two, they also bring phenomenal burst healing, and now with their new Spirit Shell talent, they can pre-shield your whole team. This can be really useful if you think about some of these most difficult fights. You know, think about like the Blood Price on Castle Nathria. Think about the Colossal Roars on Sludgefist. Pre-shielding your team with those Spirit Shells, getting people prepped, giving them that damage reduction. You know, shielding people up on Hungering Destroyer when they have the miasma where they can't actually be healed and have to leech it off of other people. Disc Priest can protect them with shields. That shielding has a lot of value, which I think is really good. They do bring Powered Barrier as well, which is the best raid defensive CD in the game, although you have to be in it. But yeah, that is slightly, I think, devalued in Castle Nathria. It's not as good as it was in previous tiers. Why? Well, it's because we have Unholy Death Knights now really showing up strong with that anti-magic zone. So you're already going to have more, you have more and stronger raid defensive CDs than we had in previous tiers, which does make the Disc Priest less essential compared to, you know, if you think about Zakul and Azhar's Eternal Palace. If you want to kill that on Mythic, you kind of needed some Disc and Holy Paladin. So it was the only way. If we were doing Zakul with the class design we have in Shadowlands, we could totally do it without those classes because of Unholy Death Knights, or, well, Death Knights just in general. The next healer we are looking at then is the Holy Priest. I'm also putting Holy Priest up in the A tier, primarily because I think in some of these early fights, they do very well of just doing some consistent healing. Their damage is also a lot better. It's quite solid damage that they can do. It's not on the level of Disc Priest or Holy Paladin, but it's solid. And in particular, the thing that moves them up to A tier for me is because of Sun King. Sun King Salvation. Holy Priest can basically single-handedly carry that fight. That's a raid boss where you beat the boss by healing up Kael'thas. Well, Holy Priest has Guardian Spirit, which is their external cooldown that increases the healing the target receives by like 60% for 10 seconds. You can use a talent to lower the cooldown to 1 minute. You can use a conduit to up the healing on like an extra 20% and the duration by like an extra 2 seconds. And they can just completely carry that fight by enhancing all the healing that you can do with your other healers, with the soul infusers, all that good stuff. Holy Priest is just incredible for that. You can even use it on things like the Rip Soul on Huntsman Altimore. There's quite a lot of uses there for the Holy Priest. So yeah, I think they do some solid healing, you know? So that's the thing. They're not the top healer in the game, that's for sure, but they are very solid. On Sun King Salvation, they are the top though, and I think that earns them an A spot just about. Next up, we have the Holy Paladin. Holy Paladin is also up in the A tier. In fact, I probably rank them above these other guys. Holy Paladin brings really good damage. They bring Devotion Aura, and the advantage of Devotion Aura, I think, unlike Disc, where Barrier got a little bit yet less useful here in this raid because of Anti-Magic Zone. Well, Devotion Aura fills in a gap that Anti-Magic Zone cannot fill. Devotion Aura gives damage reduction, 15% damage reduction to everyone in a massive area around that Holy Paladin. They don't need to stack under a barrier. They don't need to stack in one spot. So when you are spread out, when you have those damage events coming in and you can't stack under something, Devotion Aura can provide a lot of protection. You know, Warriors can do similarly with Rallying Cry, but Devotion Aura is actually... it's actually reducing damage, whereas Rallying Cry is just giving you some temporary health to deal with it. Devotion Aura actually has like healing value, sort of hidden healing value there. Holy Paladins also bring very powerful healing cooldowns, and they're very, very good at spot healing, at healing individual people, which is really powerful in this raid. There's a lot of really nasty single target bleeds that go out on fights like the Stone Legion Generals, for example. There's some really nasty bleeds that can stack up on that fight, and they're very good at tank healing too with their Beacon of Light. So Holy Paladin is actually, for me, up there in the A tier. Mistweaver Monks, I am putting in the B tier here. Mistweavers, they're doing okay. They are solid healer. They can do some really solid healing numbers. They do bring that monk utility, and certainly if you don't have a Brewmaster or you don't have a Windwalker, absolutely grab yourself a Mistweaver. It's going to be incredible. The thing that makes them not stand out as much. There's nothing like, you know, Holy Priest on Sun King. There's nothing jumping out that Mistweaver does that's insane, like these other specs, but they are still a very solid healer. They've got a lot more healing cooldowns now in Shadowlands than they did in BFA, which makes them very nice too. Our next healer spec then is Resto Druids. They are also going to go in the B tier as well, and it's very much similar to the Mistweaver here. They're doing really good healing. They have more healing cooldowns, you know, with Convoke the Spirits. They've got good healing CDs. They're doing great healing, but they're not bringing too much outside of that. They're not bringing too much outside of that healing. Again, they're not standing out crazy much on any of these other fights. I will say that, again, they do bring that Druid utility like Stampeding Roar and Innervate, and that stuff is great. But again, you probably have a few balanced Druids in there to bring Stampeding Roar. If you don't, grab yourself a Resto Druid. If you do, it does devalue them a little bit, but they're still a very solid healer. And then finally, the best healer in the game, it's the Resto Shaman. I think this is well known by now. They got a massive nerf on Mythic Day 1, but it's not enough. Resto Shaman is absolutely crushing it. There are a lot of fights in this raid where you can stack up, and Resto Shaman healing there is insane. Obviously with the Riptide Legendary, they're just doing crazy good healing throughput right now. Really, really good healing out of these guys on top of all that Resto Shaman utility. Windrush totems, Earthen Wall totems, Ancestral Protection totems, a Cheat Death totem you can use sometimes as well, and of course Spirit Link. Spirit Link with Anti-Magic Zone, that's the Castle Nathria special right there. That's the Castle Nathria special. Like Hungering Destroyer, drop down a Windrush totem, everyone's running away, drop an AMZ and a Spirit Link on them, and you're good, right? So yeah, Resto Shaman, they're doing just super, super well. They are the top healer. And yeah, that's it, guys. There you go. That's all my thoughts on all of the specs in the game right now. All of them ranked for Castle Nathria for rating. Let me know what you think as well. Like, what specs have you seen popping off in your raid? Are you jealous of any spec? Do you think there's going to be any buffs or nerfs coming? Right? That might happen. It's probably not going to happen for a week or two, but I certainly think that after Christmas, it is certainly possible that this stuff could be thrown out the window when Blizzard comes in after the race to World First, and, you know, they've let the Mythic Guild sort of compete for Hall of Fame. They're going to come in and they might tweak some of these bosses. They might tweak some of these specs, and we might see some of these specs start to climb up this list a little bit, do a little bit better, which I think would be great. Let me know, though. I'm kind of curious what you think. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.